So good morning. Welcome to the latest in our series of Donorfy deep dives. And as I'm guessing you probably all know because you signed up for it, we're looking at lists. So my name's Rich. I'm a consultant in the customer success team here at Donorfy, and most of my time helping new customers implement Donorfy in their organizations. But before I did this, I was a customer. So I've sat on your side of the fence too. I ran the engagement team for a small environmental charity, and we used it all the time. So what's a list and why should I care? There's a urban myth floating about from years ago about a philosophy exam that allegedly contained the question, is this a question? To which some bright spark allegedly replied, if it is, this is the answer, and allegedly got some good marks for it. Lists are about as far away from philosophy as it's possible to get. But if I paraphrase that, one of the easiest ways to look at lists is if we've got a question, lists are probably where we'll find the answer. It's not a reporting tool as such, more of a query tool for us to ask questions of our data. But anything that involves trying to get data out of Donorfy is probably going to involve a list at some point. So let's put this in practical terms. A common activity in fundraising is to, say, approach all the people who donate money within a certain bracket, try to move them up to the next bracket. You've probably all done this. Mrs. Jones, thanks. We are really grateful for your £5 a month that helps us do whatever, give clean water to children in Malawi. If you gave £10 a month, you could do this. Nice, effective campaigns. But to be able to implement it, we need to know who from our donors is currently in that £5 a month bracket, or whatever the bracket is that we decide. And we would use a list to find that information. Maybe you've received your charity places for a marathon or a big challenge bike ride, and you want to invite people who've done similar things in the past, or they've expressed interest in doing that. And again, we'd find a list, or we'd use a list to find that information. Once we've got that from the list, we can push it straight out to MailChimp if we want to email people, or even download it and send it to a mailing house if we feel like going old school. A slightly different use case, say you're honing your corporate donation strategy. You want to test a hypothesis. We always used to reckon that corporate donors were more likely to give at the end of the tax year than halfway through. But is that backed up by the data? With a list, we can get that information out of Donorfy, put it into another tool, something like Microsoft Excel, and analyze it further to be able to test whether our hypothesis is true or not. So at this point, you might be thinking, that's great, Rich, wonderful, but how do I actually do it? So let's dive in. Right at the top of this is a bit of a health warning. So getting good answers to questions depends on having the relevant information in Donorfy in a form that we can access. So if you practice good data hygiene, then this is going to be really easy. If your data is a bit dirty, say you've got loads of duplicates, or you've been a bit inconsistent over the years about where you've stored similar pieces of information, then you might find that you see echoes of that sort of dirty data in your list output. Donorfy has some great features to help with that. The duplicate detector in particular is a tool that I wish I'd had a few years ago. But it's always worth budgeting some time within your organization to stay on top of your data and make sure that it's clean. The cleaner it is, the better answers you'll get from it. So what types of lists are there? If you go to the lists item on the left-hand nav, it brings you into your list of lists, and down the side here we've got a list of list types. How many times can we say list in a sentence? So most of the time, I think probably my experience was that I spent more time making constituent lists than anything else. Constituent list is down here. But we've got lists for getting pretty much any entity out of Donorfy that exists within it. So a list of activities, you've got an activity list. Campaigns, there's a campaign list for that. You want to find connections between constituents, there's a connection list for that. Constituents, I've already mentioned. Constituent tag lists are an interesting one. Some people find this a bit confusing. That's to find, it's not so much looking for constituents with a certain tag, it's looking for tags and then which constituents might be attached to them. So it's a slightly different angle to look at it from. Lists of fundraising pages, lists of your opportunities for your perhaps trust and foundations pipelines, opportunity pledges, lists of recurring payment instructions, so that's your standing orders, your direct debits, soft credit lists, where transactions are soft credited across to other constituents, and then the transaction lists. And this actually is a relatively new, very new addition to the list canon, that you can now split out lists, so you can have either transaction allocations or transaction payments. And in the past, some people got a bit confused with that a transaction, when it comes in, is split in two. So you've got the money coming in, that's your payment, and then where that money has been allocated to, which could be in several different places if you split the transaction. And now you can, whereas before perhaps you used to have to use your filters to split out which one you were looking for, there are now different list types for that. The all transactions list here, however, still does what the old transaction list used to do, if you're happiest in that environment. So those are the list types. So what do we need then to get going with this? What do we need to know to make a good list? Fundamentally, I think there are three things. We need to know what question we're asking, because it's very difficult to answer a question that we don't know what the question is. We need, in technical terms, to know how the filters work, so that it returns what we need. And to get the most out of that, we need to know a bit about binary logic, and I'll cover that a little bit later. Don't be scared. And then we need to know what we can do with those list results when we've got them. So let's run through these in turn. What question we're asking sounds a bit obvious, doesn't it? But the power of lists is not in them being some sort of telepathic data mining tool that will magically answer the questions we don't know to ask. Lists are at their best when they're deployed in response to a specific question, like perhaps one of the examples that I used earlier. So in practice, then, it pays to stop and think before we dive into the list designer, so we're clear about the outcome we're aiming for. And that generally gives us better results. Moving on to filters, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, and I hope you stay with me. If you've got a question, please do ask it in the chat. Several people from the Donorfy team are on, and they'll sort of happily answer questions in the background. So it's a bit of an illustration. So I've got 4 people in this list. Say I wanted to filter it so it returned people who are singers. So what a list does is it goes through every entity. So this is a constituent list, is what it looks like. Goes through every constituent in our implementation of Donorfy, and it says, right, does this constituent match the criteria defined in the filters? And if it does match, then it's included in the list, and if it doesn't match, then it isn't. So say we were looking for singers, we'd go through this list and we'd say, is Tom Jones a singer? Well, the data says occupation singer, so we'll take that as a yes. We'll look at Captain Tom Moore. How could I not mention him at a time like this? Is he a singer? Well, apparently so, because he's got a #1 single. So he is. Is Bobby Moore a singer? Well, no, a pretty good footballer, not so much of a singer, or at least not known for it. So he would be excluded from the list. And Simone Biles, amazing gymnast, not known for being a singer. So then what we end up with is a filtered list that just has the singers, because that's what we're looking for. Now we could do this for all sorts of things. You want to know about national heroes. Is Tom Jones a national hero? Well, some people might argue this, but according to our data here, not so much. So he's a no. Captain Tom Moore, I think everyone would agree, is national hero at the moment. Bobby Moore, certainly until the next time England managed to win a World Cup, probably going to be that. And Simone Biles, the Americans like her, but probably not a national hero over here. So that gives us our answers. We can do this a bit more complicatedly too. We can sort of layer filters together. So let's look for living people who are either sports people or heroes. So Tom Jones, is he living? Yes, to the best of my knowledge. Is he a sports person or a hero? Not according to our data. So he's a no. Captain Tom Moore, magnificently soldiering on, both alive and a hero. So he would qualify for that. Bobby Moore, no longer with us. So he fails the first test of being alive. And Simone Biles is alive, and she's not a hero, but she is a sports person, or at least gymnastics is an Olympic sport. So I think we'll credit her with that. So there we go. That filters our list again. And this same process, however complex your list of filters is, this is what it's doing. It's running through your list of constituents or transactions or opportunities or whichever other list you've created, and it's saying, does this entity meet the criteria in these filters? So let's have a look at what this looks like in Donorfy. So I've created a list to get us going. I'll come back to this list tags bit later on. It's a new feature that I wish I'd had a while back for helping us keep our lists organized. So I've got my example constituent list here. I'm just going to go through and delete those filters to start with. So let's start with a really simple list. I want to know all the constituents in my database whose constituent type is individual. And there's a few of them, 2,800 in this database. And to find that, we've just added our filter in that says constituent type equals individual. So let's just break this down a bit. So if you ignore for the moment these end boxes here for brackets, because I'm going to come back to them, you've got field, comparison, and value. The field is just which part of our data we're looking at, and pretty much all of the data that you have about any constituent or any other entity that you're listing on is available in this list. It's a big old list. Rather than scrolling down, it's probably a lot quicker to type. So if you start typing something, then it'll give you a filtered list of the fields that you could use for that. And the comparison is how we're going to compare it. It's fairly logical and straightforward. And there are all sorts of options in here. Is it the same as? Is it not the same as? Less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. We can look at things like, is it empty or is it not empty? Does it contain something? Does it not contain? That would be a piece of text. Is it between two things? And I'll use that example a bit later on. Is it in a list of things? So you could say, let's say we were looking for people called Moore and people called Smith. We could have, is it in the list? And the list could be Moore and Smith. Or is it not in the list? For this one, we're just going to stick with the basic equals. And then value here is what we're trying to match it to. So for those fields, such as constituent type, where there's only a certain number of things that it could be, this becomes a drop-down box, so we can't just compare it to something that would never be in the system. we've got a number of constituent types set up in this database. I could look for churches, I could look for companies, tribute funds. I'm just going to go for individual here. And that's a filter. So this would run through, it's a constituent list, so it would run through every constituent. And if they are of the individual constituent type, it would include them in the list. And if they're not, it'll leave them out. So let's be a bit more specific. What if we wanted to limit it to constituents who were between 18 and 40 years old? So I can add a new include filter here. So I'm going to look at date of birth here, and then I'm going to use the between comparison. So you'll notice that now we've gone onto a date field, there are all sorts of other comparisons we could use. I doubt there's anyone in our database whose date of birth is next month, but I guess that would always be theoretically possible. Let's go for between. And if we're looking for 18 to 40-year-olds, then by my reckoning, that would be 2002 and 1980, wouldn't it? So let's go with that. So date of birth between today in 1980 and today in 2002. Come back up here, hit the save and update preview. And whereas before we had, I think it was 2,800, we're now down to 9. I guess this is like most charities where everyone's a bit older. So, so we've become much more specific. But what if we want to narrow it down even more? Well, we just add another filter. We can keep going doing this. Let's look at people who are tagged as bungee jumpers. I always wanted to. There we go. So update that now. What we've now got is we've got a list of constituents who are between 18 and 40 and have expressed an interest in bungee jumping. The thing is, though, that I'm aware of a little gotcha here, which is that not everyone in my database here has their date of birth in the system. So somehow I need to accommodate those who might be in that age bracket, but who aren't showing up here because they don't have a date of birth. So why don't I add another filter? And I'm going to put date of birth is empty. And if it is empty here, then I don't need to put anything in the value field. So the thing is here, though, that this isn't going to work. I'm going to get nothing, because it's not possible, logically, to have a date of birth between the 6th of May 1980 and the 6th of May 2002 and have the date of birth be empty, because you couldn't have one between those dates if it was empty. So what I actually need to do is I need to get a bit clever. I'm going to move this last line that I've just created up by using this little button here. And I'm going to use an or instead of an and I'm going to put some brackets around it. Now, if we try that, we've got 6 entries. At this point, you would be entirely forgiven for saying, "Whoa, what's this? We've got brackets, we've got ands and ors." So let's just step back a bit and make sure that we're happy with the logic of what's just happened here. So, forgive me if this sounds a little like a school lesson. Binary logic is concerned with something being true, or yes, or false, or no. So I've got a few examples. If we use a logical and, then tick and tick is a yes, because and needs both sides to be true or to be saying yes in order to return a true value or a yes value. So tick and cross is a no because they're not both the same, or rather they're not both yes. Cross and cross is still no because they need to both be yes in order to get a yes value out. In the context of lists, the yes value is us saying, yes, we want to include this constituent or this entity in our list. The other operator is or. And the difference is that or only requires one side of it to be true in order to return a yes value. So if they're both yes, then we get a yes. If one of them is yes, it doesn't matter which side, then we get a yes value. But if they're both no, then we still get a no. So far, so simple. Where it gets fun is that we can start building these into much longer statements. We can add brackets. You remember your BODMaths from GCSE Maths. So if you look at this one, we've got an or statement in brackets, and then we've got an and statement outside the bracket. If we simplify that, this or statement resolves to yes, because one of them is right. The and stays where it is. So really, this top statement is the same as the bottom statement, which is yes and yes, which gives us a yes value. You can go really silly with it. So you could go more silly than that. But that you could interpret that one in exactly the same way. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to look at it and see if you come up with the right answer. So taking the approach that I took with the last one, just you could do a sort of thumbs up, thumbs down. Thumbs up if you think it's yes, and thumbs down if you think it's no. So there's the simplification, which probably makes it rather easier to read. Within the bracket, yes or no resolves to yes. Within this bracket, yes or no resolves to yes. Yes or no resolves to yes. So what you end up with is yes and yes and yes and yes and yes, which gives us yes. Make sense? So let's crack on. Now we know how binary logic works, let's apply it to the filters that we've just been looking at. So these are the filters that I added to the list just now. And so if you remember, we had constituent type as individual, date of birth is between 1980 and 2002, or date of birth is empty, active tags has any of bungee jumper. So if we break this down, so we've got, we're looking for individual constituents, 18 to 40-year-olds, date of birth empty perhaps, bungee jumper. And we've got some brackets. So the brackets went in the box. They effectively surround, if you laid this out with each row end to end, those brackets would surround those middle two statements. So then we've got our logical operators coming in there. And so that gives us this, this logical assessment. So we run a constituent through this, and let's say, yes, they're an individual. Yes, they're between 18 and 40 years old. Their date of birth is not empty, and they are a bungee jumper. Now, because this bit here is in the brackets, the two of these would resolve to a yes, which means that we would include this constituent in the list. If they were a company, however, we wouldn't include them in the list because they would have failed the statement. So there we go. So now we know how, we figured out what question we're asking. We've built a stack of filters to get the results we want. And we're back looking at the output from our list. So the question now, I guess, is what do we do with it? We can read it. We can do a reasonable amount of reading within Donorfy. We can sort based on columns. You want all the misters together? Then it will do that. You want them sorted by last name? Then we can do that. We can look at different bits of information that we might hold on these constituents. This little book just here gives us access to the field list. There are a few. And so maybe we want to know what their total annual giving looks like if that's in. So we like the top guy. And we can also move these around. So if we want to reorder them to just make it a little easier to read, then we can do that too. We can then look at taking the results of this list out of Donorfy and using it elsewhere. We've got a couple of options for that. So this, just on this bar at the top, this button here allows us to download a CSV file, effectively a spreadsheet of all the data we've got. A few useful options for that, only including the selected columns. So that would be the columns that you've selected here. That allows you to produce a much more manageable spreadsheet than if you produce one that has every single one of these columns in. They do get a bit hard to manage, particularly when a lot of those columns might be empty based on your data. Combining people at the same address into one row is really useful if you're doing a mailing and you want to send one thing to a household where you might have several supporters. The alternate label name and salutation is really helpful if you've got people in the same household. You can set their alternate name and salutation so that your letter is addressed to David and Jean, for example, rather than just David if they're both supporters. And you can add an activity to the timeline. So if you were downloading this to send it off to a mailing house, for example, then you could come in here, you could add an activity type. So where would it be? One of these. Say you've got an activity for your campaign. Can't find one for the moment, but you can add an activity in there, and that would add an activity to the timeline of everybody who is on this list, which means that you then don't have to take the additional step later on of going in and saying, no, these guys all got this one campaign. So that's downloading. Once you've got it out, obviously you can do anything that you might want to do in any other tool that you might have available to you. So you might pull it up in Excel and start playing around with it. That's particularly useful, I used to find, with transaction lists, where you might want to aggregate some of the data and ask perhaps more involved questions of it using a tool that's really good at asking questions of numeric data. You might send it to a mailing house, as I've already said. Those options are available to you. Other things you can do with it, though, you can simply apply a tag, one of the tags that's already defined in your system, to every constituent that's on the list. So this little one here, find the tag that you want, and click go, and it will apply that tag to the constituent. So that where you'll end up there is that the constituents who are on the list at the time you run the list will get the tag. If their circumstances change, then they'll still have that tag unless you've done something different. So that might be worth thinking about. It's a sort of, I look at that as a short-term way of applying a tag, rather than perhaps something for data that's going to persist for a long time. You can, with this one here, you can prepare a PDF report. If you include the totals, I believe it's subtotals based on how you've sorted your list further down. So you can define which column you want to sort on, include the totals, and it will run subtotals for you on that if you so desire. That'll give you a PDF ready for printing. This next one is a slightly scary one, because this allows you to archive everybody who's on your list, which means they probably won't appear in most of your other lists. You can, for what it's worth, you can still run lists that include archived people. Just up at the top of the filters, you've got this list should include archived constituents, defaults to no. But if you click that to yes, then archived constituents will obviously appear in the list. But a use case for this might be if you're doing a sort of annual cleanup. You've got a few constituents who now another year has gone by and you still haven't heard anything from them. They haven't responded to any of your campaigns. They haven't given you any money. It might be time to think that if they haven't given you anything for 10 years, they might not be going to give you anything, and that it might be time to get them off your database. So you can create a list with the filters that you want to define to define that group of people, and then you can bulk archive them and take them out of your main constituent lists. Once they're in the archive, you can then run the bulk delete function if you want, which is even scarier than the bulk archive, and that will permanently remove them from your system. So moving on, the last one here is the MailChimp update. So we can push from a list to MailChimp if we want to send emails to the people who are on this list. Other things that you can do that aren't in this little block. So I mentioned the tag button here. There's also the auto tag feature. I'm not going to get into it now because it will be too easy to rabbit trail off. But that allows you to define a process that runs every night that will strip all the tags out, run the list, and then reapply the tags based on who's on the list now. That's really helpful if you're looking for things like a tag for people who have donated in the last 30 days, for example. If you've got that list set up, then every night when it runs, anyone who donated 31 days ago will then drop off. That tag will disappear from them. It just makes it easier to keep your tags in shape so that you can use them to answer the questions you want to ask. And then also there's a clever and almost frustratingly buried tool in the campaign section for when you're building an audience for your campaigns that allows you to use different lists to segment that campaign, which is quite helpful perhaps if you want to split test your campaign and send different things to different people. Lastly, a very recent addition is that you can now access lists and the results of lists through the Donorfy API. Lots of people don't use the API, but if you're lucky enough to have a developer on tap, then their code now can read the results directly off a list, and that in certain cases will help their code because it means they probably have to make fewer API calls. So that's that. Once we've got our heads around that, which I guess is sort of the fundamentals, I guess we can take it further. So let's just run off that. You can have quite a lot of fun with lists if you're inclined to be a geek. If you treat lists as building blocks, you can use the results of one list as an input to another. So say I wanted to know which constituents had either donated in each of the last 4 months or had volunteered as door-to-door collectors. Say I've got a tag for that one. I could define a transaction list to pick up the donations, and an activity list or a tag list to find out who'd volunteered. If I then run auto tag on both of those lists, I can create a constituent list to pick up constituents with the tags that have been applied by the auto tags, which gives us a nice little cascade, so we can develop quite complex queries based on the characteristics and the behavior of our constituents. And that is really quite powerful. And then if your organization is on the owner-jure option, you also have access to custom lists. And as much as anything in the world of data is limitless, custom lists pretty much are. So that allows you to write SQL queries to query the underlying data and then surface that data in a list for other people in your organization to access. There's a bit more overhead involved in setting them up. You'll need to be on owner-jure to be able to do that, and you'll need either specific expertise in-house or a bit of help from the customer success team to get it implemented. But that gives you some seriously powerful tools for querying your data if you've got very specific use cases. So I want to move on to what happens when it goes wrong, because with the best will in the world, the first time you build a list, if it's got any complexity, it probably doesn't work in my experience. So my top tips from having done this a few times would be, if your list isn't working and you're getting frustrated, go and have a cup of tea, because everything is better when you've taken a break from your screen and recalibrated your sense of reality. When you come back to it, everything comes back in lists to the basic building blocks of binary logic that I was talking about earlier. And so working out what's gone wrong with the list needs to be a very methodical process. So my suggestion would be to make a note of what filters you've had, strip them all out, and then start rebuilding your list one filter at a time. It's quite helpful if you can identify a record that you are expecting to see in your list, and then every time you add a filter, go and make sure that that record is still there. Or you could go the inverse as well, identify a record that you're not expecting to see in your list, and every time you add a filter, make sure that that one's not there as well. And go through that, trying to build the list back up, because that will tell you which filter line it is that that you're struggling with, that isn't firing as you'd like it to. Back when I was a customer, we had literally hundreds of lists, and keeping track of them all was a bit of a nightmare. We had these sort of crazy naming conventions where we all had our initials on the ends of lists and things, which was fine until someone, usually me, forgot to put the initials on, and then no one knew who the list was. Since then, the team have added some more features to help us keep lists organized. So if I come back out to my list of lists, up here we've got list tags. My list today was categorized as deep dive. So I created a deep dive list tag, and then I applied that to the list that I was looking for, so I knew I could find it quickly when I needed to. Other tags we've got set up in here, there's tags for Robin and Chloe for when they're demoing things using this data. We might tag lists as being lists about major donors. So you could, if you've got different teams or different sort of functions all pouring into Donorfy with their own things, then you could say, well, this is the Trust and Foundations set of lists. They've got a tag on them. You can have multiple tags, so lists can be shared between different people if you want to. And then for constituent lists, if you want to be able to get to a list quickly because it's a list that you use a lot, you've got this show in menu button here. So if I click that, then the list will appear in the little drop down underneath constituent. So you can see I've got example constituent list showing up here now. That just helps you come back to a list that you use a lot. If I leave this which users can see box blank, then everyone will see it in their drop down. If I only want me to see it, then I can do that and specify that this is just one for me to see. So it still appears in mine, but it then won't appear, for example, in Robin's. It won't clutter up his left-hand menu. And then the last thing, which is, it almost looks like a security feature. It's not a security feature. It's a prevention of accidental destruction feature. But you've got this little locked button here. Anyone can unlock a list, so you're not tying it down too much. But if I click that, then I will be unable to add another filter or change these filters. They've all grayed out without first unlocking the list. Particularly helpful this if you're using things like lots of auto tags and you've got a list that's being used for an auto tag. You could make quite a mess of your data processes if someone inadvertently changed that list and hadn't realized what they've done. So this is just a sort of little safety break to stop someone accidentally stuffing up your entire data operation. No one's popular when that happens. Great. So I've just got a little video of supposed to autoplay. Mark Zuckerberg admitting to a mistake. We all make mistakes. So these are some of the common ones that we see that come into support. Starting to build a list without clearly understanding the question that we're asking is something that trips people up a lot. And I can't really emphasize that enough, that the more clearly we understand the question, the easier it's going to be to find an answer to it. People do often get confused too with the constituent tag list and the constituent list. The major advantage of a constituent tag list, certainly in my experience, is that you can use a constituent tag list to pull out custom fields that might be stored in the tags. In a constituent list, you can filter based on whether or not someone has a tag attached to their record, which is useful, but you can't get to that deeper stuff, whereas a constituent tag list allows you to do that. Think of the constituent tag list as a list of tags rather than a list of constituents, and a constituent list as a list of constituents. And probably by far the most commonly used list type. And then it's really easy, once you get into more complex queries, to trip over brackets and or statements. If you're looking at a filter block like this, obviously there's no space on the screen to do it, but what you want to do is to take these each individual line and imagine that they're all in one single line going along, and the brackets then will make sense, which will help you to sort of debug what's going on. If you open a bracket, remember you need to close it, and if you've got brackets inside brackets, which you can do, then again you've got to keep count of how many brackets you've opened and where you need to close them. Binary logic's really simple, but because it's so simple, it's also not very clever. So the system isn't going to be able to tell you, oh, you've not put that bracket in the right place, because it's simply not going to know. Okay, so just want to talk briefly about who gets to see what function, because some of these are restricted. So all of the basic list functionality stuff that I've talked about, that's all available across the board. So essentials, professional, doesn't matter. You get all of that as part of your base package. If you want to get into auto tagging, that's a professional feature. So you'll need to be on the paid plan for that. Campaign segments is again a paid professional feature. And custom lists is not just professional, but you need to be on own Azure, which is where the database that holds your data actually resides in your own Microsoft Azure environment. That tends to be the larger clients where we see that being taken up. And there's an additional cost to that. If that sort of custom list thing is something that you're thinking, actually, that sounds really powerful and might really help us, then do come and talk to us, and we can talk about whether or not it makes sense to get you up and running on your own Azure server. So that's the end